Hello, and welcome to Box in the Basement podcast. I'm your host, Arlene.
And I'm Leah.
In the last 50 years, the U.S. has had nearly 1 million homicides, and since then, over 250,000 cases sit in a box in a basement where all hopes for justice go to die. In 1996, someone shot my uncle Leon Laurelis, changing my life forever and leaving a devastating hole in my heart, and his case remains unsolved. Join me and my wife Leah as we shed light on these forgotten victims, their life, the loved ones they left behind, the evidence, and the theories of who committed these crimes, leaving communities in fear and leaving families without answers. Support our effort to change the justice system through the Homicide Families Victims' Rights Act, as we hope to make a difference with our audience as we remember the victims and demand justice. Please note that this episode contains depictions of violence that some people may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Kathy Ann Hammel had a coworker drop her off at home on March 23, 1998. Her boyfriend briefly saw her at home before leaving himself, but when he returned a few hours later, she was gone, and she's never been seen again. Kathy Ann left behind a young daughter, a loving family, and a ton of unanswered questions. It's been 27 years, and this case is as cold as it gets.
1998 saw the Good Friday Agreement signed, which ended much of the ethno-nationalist violence in Northern Ireland. Massive protests in Indonesia resulted in over 1,000 deaths. Hurricane Mitch became one of the deadliest Atlantic hurricanes in recorded history. The Kosovo War and the Second Congo War started, and U.S. President Bill Clinton was impeached for lying about getting a Hummer, which seems just so pedestrian in light of recent events. The Winter Olympics were held in Nagano, Japan, where Germany dominated the medal count. American figure skater Tara Lipinski became the youngest Olympic gold medalist, and Dutch speed skaters won literally half the medals in that sport. France hosted the World Cup that summer with the French team beating Brazil in the final. Will Smith topped the Billboard Hot 100 with Gettin' Jiggy With It. Clint Black had the #1 song on the country charts with Nothing But the Taillights. Titanic was #1 at the box office and had been for the previous 13 weeks. John Grisham's The Street Lawyer topped the New York Times bestseller list for fiction. We've discussed Houston's history in several other episodes, so we'll give you the highlights here. The population of Houston proper in 1998 was about 1.8 million. The Houston Astros were a force to be reckoned with. The Houston Comets won their second WNBA title. The Astrodome was still a major landmark, and the city itself was in the midst of a growth spurt centered around the numerous energy companies with headquarters there. Crime rates overall in the United States were declining at the end of the 1990s, and the same held true for Houston in most cases, though there were a few areas in the city with higher than average rates of both violent and property crime. Keep in mind that Houston is a huge city. It's the most populous city in Texas and the fourth most populous in the U.S. It's also huge area-wise, over 640 square miles, which is over half the size of the entire state of Rhode Island, just for reference.
Catherine Ann Hammel, better known to her friends and family as Kathy Ann, was born on January 26, 1970, in Sussex County, New Jersey. She moved with her mother and sister to El Paso, Texas in 1977. Kathy Ann graduated from high school, went to work, and eventually settled down with her boyfriend, Jose Areneles. The couple moved in together and had a daughter. In 1998, 28-year-old Kathy Ann worked 2 jobs to support her family. She was employed at 24 Hour Fitness, and she also worked part-time at Nick's Sports Bar and Grill. Her friends and family describe her as fun-loving and absolutely committed to her little girl, who was just 2.5 at the time of her disappearance. Kathy Ann and her boyfriend didn't have the best relationship, according to those closest to her. But as far as I know, there was never any indication of serious trouble or violence. Most descriptions I've seen characterize the relationship as rocky. Kathy Ann was feeling ill and left her shift at 24-Hour Fitness early on the afternoon of Monday, March 23, 1998, and she had a coworker drop her off at her apartment complex. This was around 2 p.m. Her boyfriend Jose claims to have seen her at home at around 3 p.m., but he left shortly thereafter. A recurring theme in this case is that we just don't have tons of details. Police are keeping things very close hold, so we don't really know much about Jose's movements that afternoon. According to Jose, he returned to the couple's apartment at around 6 p.m. the same day, and Kathy Ann was gone. And here is where the timeline gets a little sketchy. One of Kathy Ann's friends called her mother, Catherine Henderson, who had relocated to Buffalo, New York after Kathy Ann missed work 2 days in a row. So Kathy Ann's boyfriend, Jose, didn't bother to inform her mother that she was missing. She had to find out from a friend who only knew of the situation herself because Kathy Ann failed to show up for her shifts. Catherine immediately got on the phone and flew to Houston and confronted Jose at the couple's apartment on Thursday, March 26th. She said in a couple of interviews that Jose had cuts and scratches all over his face when she showed up at the apartment. Catherine demanded he give her a set of keys to the house, which he did. He left the apartment and never returned. Catherine's mother changed the locks on the apartment door, and she stayed there for months talking to law enforcement and organizing searches for her missing daughter. In the meantime, Jose kept the couple's daughter and moved in with his own family.
Houston PD initially treated Kathy Ann's disappearance as a missing persons case, since her boyfriend claimed that she was alive and well the last time he saw her that fateful afternoon, and there was no body, just a missing adult. But Catherine Henderson knew better. Kathy Ann was a dedicated parent, and as we've discussed in previous episodes, it would take a lot for an involved parent to just up and leave their young child with no warning, no forwarding address, nothing. It was ultimately that realization that caused Houston police to change course and transfer the case to homicide. But the problem here is that there is literally no evidence that a crime was committed. Investigators noted that a rug was missing from the living room in Kathy Ann and Jose's apartment, but that doesn't mean much, not even in this context. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing except the rug out of place inside the home. Police questioned friends, neighbors, and coworkers, and the only suspicious thing that came up was that Kathy Ann and Jose had a fight the day before she disappeared. I've seen this fight reported 2 different ways. First was that they argued in person at the sports bar where Kathy Ann worked. Second is that she was arguing with Jose over the phone. He called the bar several times over the course of her shift, and these calls upset her to the point where customers noticed and told investigators as much when questioned.
And both accounts could well be accurate. There's nothing to say that Jose didn't show up to argue in person and call her on the phone. Police interviewed Jose, but according to Kathy Ann's mother, he refused to answer a single question. And of course, since this is an open case, we don't have much information. Nothing has been made public. The first year after Kathy Ann went missing, the police were very involved and proactive, conducting searches on foot and by air. Volunteers and friends and family also organized massive foot searches looking for clues, but nobody ever found a thing. Not a piece of clothing, no remains, nothing. As we mentioned earlier, Catherine Henderson stayed in her daughter's apartment for months after she went missing. She searched for Kathy Ann herself. She canvassed the neighborhood. She put up flyers, the works. The case got a lot of local media attention at first, but it quickly fizzled out as the case grew cold and no updates came. Catherine Henderson eventually went back home. Then she moved to New Jersey, and time marched on with no breaks in the case, no DNA hits, nothing. Every year, Catherine returned to Houston to speak with investigators in person and to hold a press conference to keep Kathy Ann's name in the public eye. In 2006, she had a memorial service for her daughter, something she was reluctant to do, but with absolutely no movement on the case, it was time for some semblance of closure. Over the years, Catherine has started receiving pushback from law enforcement, which is obviously very frustrating. I'm in the same boat, so I can empathize. Catherine's life hasn't been easy since that day in 1998. Her husband divorced her in the wake of the stress of Kathy Ann's disappearance, and her other daughter has gone no contact. Catherine kept in touch with her granddaughter, Kathy Ann's daughter, for 10 years while she was in her father's care. But that ended in 2008, when Catherine told her she thought her father was responsible for Kathy Ann's death. Jose forbade her from having contact after that point.
So what happened to Kathy Ann Hammel on March 23, 1998? Because she was a grown adult, we have to consider the possibility that she disappeared voluntarily. I do not think this is the case, but we'll step through it anyway. Kathy Ann absolutely had some stressors in her life. She had a young kid at home. Kids are stressful, especially when they're 2.5, 3 years old. They never stop moving. She worked 2 jobs, both of which dealt with the public, which can be exhausting. I don't know if Jose worked or not, but if you're working 2 jobs and only have 1 car between you, finances are probably adding to the stress in some capacity. Friends and family described Jose and Kathy Ann's relationship as quote-unquote rocky. All this to say, there are indeed reasons that Kathy Ann might have wanted to walk away and start over, but there are things that make that highly unlikely, in my opinion anyway. First and foremost was the couple's daughter. By all accounts, Kathy Ann was a great mother, totally devoted to her little girl. And as we've discussed in other cases, while it's not unheard of for a devoted parent to walk away from their child, it is unusual. Especially without making contact later on or leaving a note or telling a friend or family anything. Kathy Ann essentially disappeared. There are no records of her bank accounts being used or any activities on her credit cards if she had any. This was before cell phones were in everyone's pockets, and nothing I've read indicates that she had one. So there was no examining cell phone records or tracking movements that way.
And as far as I could tell, nothing significant was missing from the home that would indicate she left on her own. You'd think someone running away to start a new life would take some clothes, a backpack or suitcase, toiletries, but by all accounts, Kathy Ann was last seen in her work clothes, a t-shirt and shorts. And as we said earlier, the only thing her mother and the police could determine was missing from the house was a rug from the living room. And that brings us to our next theory, that she was the victim of foul play. I find this explanation the most likely one, given everything we just discussed in the voluntary disappearance theory. Kathy Ann's boyfriend, Jose, has been a person of interest since the case was moved to homicide. But because there's so little evidence to go on, no charges were ever filed. And Jose apparently didn't cooperate with investigators. According to Kathy Ann's mom, he never answered any questions. I don't know that this is entirely true because we do have Jose's timeline for that afternoon.
I read somewhere that Jose's father was the Guatemalan ambassador to the U.S. at the time, so whether or not he was involved in Kathy Ann's disappearance, I'm betting that's why Jose kept his mouth shut. International scandals tend to be bad for diplomats' careers. Well, they used to be anyway, but I digress.
And again, because this is still an open case, we don't have access to the case files. So all we have to go on here is what Kathy Ann's mom, Catherine, has said. According to her, investigators theorized pretty early on that Jose was involved. She went as far as to say that investigators believed he rolled her up in that living room rug and disposed of her remains, likely in a dumpster. We do know that the two didn't have a great relationship, and there are multiple witnesses that say they were fighting the night before she disappeared. Another thing I forgot to mention earlier was that Kathy Ann's co-workers from the gym dropped her off at home. The co-workers saw Jose. Jose then claims he left home about an hour later, was gone for about 3 hours, and when he returned, Kathy Ann was gone.
This was Monday afternoon, right?
Yes. Again, I don't know if Jose had a job, but leaving for 3 hours in the middle of the day seems a little strange given the circumstances, unless he was doing shift work or otherwise working odd hours, but we don't know what he was doing for those 3 hours.
Right. It does seem a little odd and a little too convenient. In the interest of fairness, we have to consider the possibility that someone else harmed Kathy Ann. If Jose was in fact gone for 3 hours, that is absolutely enough time for someone else to kill or subdue Kathy Ann and then wrap her in a rug and carry her outside and then take her somewhere she'd never be found. At the same time, it was in the afternoon on a Monday, and they lived in an apartment complex. I would think it would be extremely risky to carry a person wrapped in a rug out to your car in those conditions. Kathy Ann was relatively small, 5'3" and 120 pounds, so it wouldn't be a stretch to assume a grown man could carry her outside without much trouble.
And we have to consider the fact that Jose might have just lied about the timeline. The last time anyone else saw Kathy Ann was at 2 p.m. He could have just made up that timeline to give himself an alibi. If he was involved in her disappearance, he very well could have just waited until after dark and then used the rug.
That is very true. And if we're considering that it might have been someone else entirely, he could have just made up that timeline to keep the heat off of him. Or maybe he never came home and he doesn't know what happened, and he just lied because it would look bad if he was out all night. I'm going down a rabbit hole, though. Do we know where the couple's daughter was that afternoon?
We don't. There's no mention of her in any of the articles or reports I've got. That being said, Jose had family in Houston at the time, so it's possible she was with them. I know after Kathy Ann went missing, Jose moved in with his mother, who essentially ended up raising the little girl. So if the baby wasn't in the house that afternoon, my best guess is that she was with family.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that's where we are now in the spring of 2025. Catherine Ann Hammel was 28 years old at the time of her disappearance. She is 5'3" and 120 pounds, has brown eyes, and wore her brown hair long in 1998. She has pierced ears and a small scar near her left eye. The day she went missing, Kathy Ann was wearing a purple 24-hour fitness t-shirt, athletic shorts, and white sneakers. She was wearing earrings, a ring with the letter C on it, and was carrying a black purse. If you have any information about her disappearance, please contact the Houston Police Department at 713-308-3600. Christopher Sanders was living in a camper outside of Monahans, Texas, while working in the oil fields, and he was having a rough time. It's a tough industry. The hours are long, the work is exhausting, and in this case, Chris was separated from his family. On the morning of August 13, 2017, Chris left his camper and walked towards the interstate. He never came back, and he's never been seen again. It's been nearly 8 years, and Chris's family still has no idea what happened that day.
2017 saw the implementation of contentious U.S. travel bans on several Muslim-majority countries. The GOP's plan to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act failed miserably. North Korea launched a ballistic missile over Japan. Stephen Paddock opened fire on the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival in Las Vegas, killing 58 people. And Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria resulted in massive destruction. Despacito topped the Billboard Hot 100 the week of August 13th, and Sam Hunt's Body Like a Back Road dominated the country charts that week and most weeks in 2017. The horror film Annabelle Creation was #1 at the box office, and Michael Connelly's The Late Show topped the New York Times bestseller list. Chris Sanders and his wife lived in Kaysen, Texas, but he was staying in Monahans at the time of his disappearance, so that's what we'll discuss here. Monahans is a small town in the far western part of the state that straddles Ward and Winkler counties in the heart of the Permian Basin. Today, the population of the town is right around 7,300 and was just slightly larger in 2017. The area was populated by Comanche, Mescalero and Lipan Apache, and other indigenous peoples, and the first known European explorer transited the region in 1583. As the railroad sprawled across Texas, settlers moved west, and Monahans grew up as an agricultural center. The population more than quadrupled after oil was discovered in 1929, and the town's economy shifted to the energy sector over the succeeding decades. The big draw in Monahans today is the Monahans Sandhills State Park, where you can slide down the sand dunes, hike, and camp.
40-year-old Chris Sanders had been a truck driver for 20 years before deciding to go work in the oil fields of West Texas with his uncle and cousin in April of 2017 because the money was good. I remember that time out here in West Texas. Tons of oil field jobs, and the money was good. Chris, also known as Dog to his friends, lived with his family in Kaysen, Texas, which is clear on the other side of the state near Arkansas and Louisiana. It's about an 8-hour drive from Monahans. Chris was married at the time of his disappearance, and he and his wife Angela had 6 children between them and 10 grandkids. I've read some of the posts and comments on the Facebook page dedicated to Chris's case, and he seemed like a great guy. According to friends and family, he was hilarious, silly, good-natured, and a dedicated family man who loved his kids and grandkids and his church family. Chris had some health problems. He was on medication for high blood pressure and bipolar disorder. And by the time he disappeared, the stress of working in the oil fields so far away from his family was starting to get to him. In the week leading up to his disappearance, Angela noticed that Chris was acting differently when she talked to him on the phone. She pressed him for answers, but couldn't get a clear picture of what was wrong. The night before he disappeared, he said, quote, "I'm so tired and I don't know how much longer I can take this." Chris attended a cookout with his coworkers that evening, and those colleagues reported later that Chris seemed off, agitated, but he didn't disclose to anyone there what was bothering him.
On the morning of Sunday, August 13th, according to a witness, Chris left his trailer, hopped over a fence, and started walking towards I-20, which ran very close to the trailer park where he was staying. Chris's cousin Cody, who also worked with him and lived with him in the trailer, called his phone about 45 minutes later and asked where he was. Chris answered his phone and said he was walking eastbound on Interstate 20. Cody offered to go pick him up so they could talk about what was bothering him, but Chris insisted he just needed to walk. Then he hung up. Cody called back a few minutes later, and Chris's phone went straight to voicemail. While this was slightly odd, walking along an interstate isn't the best or safest place to be, it didn't immediately raise any red flags. Angela Sanders didn't call her husband that morning. She was up early and headed to church, and figured Chris had had a late night since he'd been out partying with his coworkers. After church, Angela did try to call Chris, but his phone kept going straight to voicemail.
Chris failed to show up to work the next day, and Angela knew something was seriously wrong. So she jumped in her car and drove the 8 hours west to Monahans. She met law enforcement at Chris's trailer, and they found no sign of foul play. The door to the trailer was locked. There was plenty of food in the fridge. There were no signs of a struggle. Nothing disturbed or missing except Chris's wallet and keys. However, police did find that while Chris's house was locked, his truck was not. In fact, the driver's side door was open. Chris had also left his medication behind. Things started to fall into place in Angela's head, and she began to wonder if Chris had stopped taking his medication prior to his disappearance, and that's why he'd been acting so strangely.
So from the start, the police considered this a missing persons case and have leaned toward the theory that Chris left on his own, given the phone call with his cousin and the fact that he was seen leaving his trailer under his own power. But investigators have turned up nothing in the 7 years since he went missing. There was one possible sighting of Chris reported in 2020, but that turned out to be nothing. Over the past 7 years, Chris's bank account and credit cards haven't been used, and his phone, while it was initially able to provide some insight into Chris's movements, was turned off shortly after he was seen leaving home and was never turned back on. In the fall of 2024, a group called Advocates for Closure attempted to organize another search near the area where Chris was supposedly last seen walking. The group wanted to start their search at Monahans Sand Hills State Park and go from there. I haven't seen any follow-up on this search, though, if it ever happened, but it just goes to show that there is still significant public interest in this case, and there are organizations out there willing to invest the time and resources to help families get answers.
So what happened to Chris Sanders on August 13, 2017? We always talk about the possibility that adults who go missing leave on their own. And I think this is one of those situations where that might be the most reasonable conclusion. We know from phone conversations and statements from his friends, family, and coworkers that Chris was having a tough time. Some articles have painted a much more grim and depressing picture of Chris's life before he went missing. That he hated his life, that he was miserable and depressed, etc. But his family and friends insist that wasn't entirely accurate. Sure, Chris was having a bit of a rough time right then, but he generally loved his life and was a happy guy. His mother, Sandy, insists that he wouldn't just walk away from his family like that, and most people seem to agree. We've all had moments in our lives where things really suck and seem inescapable, but that typically doesn't mean we always hate our lives.
Oh, for sure. I experienced a rough patch a couple years ago. I was having some issues getting my meds straight. I was having a tough time adjusting to a career change. I was dealing with an injury that prevented me from doing things I liked. It was the lowest point in my life. But then I changed jobs, changed meds, and I went to a Brandy Carlisle concert and things went back to normal.
Brandy makes everything better. But I agree. I think maybe that's what was happening here. Chris told his wife he was tired and frustrated. It was probably just time for a change.
So that brings up another point. We know Chris had bipolar disorder and was medicated, so maybe there is some truth to the theory that he just stopped taking his meds?
That was my thought initially. Yes, it seems from accounts from friends and family that he wouldn't voluntarily leave. But if he was having some kind of mental health crisis, or if he was experiencing disorientation or severe depression from not being on his meds, that could certainly lead to some questionable decisions. I don't have any experience with bipolar meds, but I know they can have some unpleasant side effects.
Yes, and those of us on mental health meds can also get lulled into a false sense of security. Our meds make us feel better, so we're like, maybe I don't need these meds anymore and stop taking them, especially if there are negative side effects. It becomes a vicious cycle if you're not careful.
So if Chris did leave on his own, either voluntarily or due to mental health issues, where did he go? That's the main question. We do have the witness statement saying he spoke to Chris as he was walking down I-20. So I tend to believe that the other witness statement saying they saw Chris leave the trailer park under his own power are correct. Was he trying to hitch a ride home? Was he trying to hitch a ride somewhere else for whatever reason?
This is where I get stumped. Chris had his own vehicle that was in good working condition as far as I know. If he was just wanting to get away or if he wanted to drive back home, he could have just gotten into his own Tahoe and left. It's apparent he did get in the car at some point because the driver's side door was left open. It's honestly baffling. But again, if you're in the midst of a crisis, you aren't necessarily going to make decisions that make sense to other people. Regardless, I think even if Chris did try to leave on his own, he later encountered a bad actor or got himself into some kind of accident.
That's my thought. It's likely he did leave under his own power, but then had some sort of encounter or accident later on. Maybe he did get picked up by a trucker or someone else heading east, and they harmed him or kidnapped him. Remember, Chris's bank accounts and credit cards were never used. He only had his wallet and keys with him. He didn't take a bag or anything of value to pawn or sell to get money. We covered a case last year where a woman was hit by a car on the highway, and the cops theorized that her body was later moved to another section of the road to cover up a hit and run. That may be the case here as well. Maybe Chris was just walking along I-20 to blow off some steam or clear his head, and someone hit him. If he'd been left where he was hit, it would stand to reason someone would have found his remains by now. But if that person was afraid of prosecution and moved Chris's body after the fact, then he may never be found, and this may never be solved.
Do we think that someone kidnapped Chris from his trailer? I've seen that floated as a possible explanation as well.
Obviously, we can't rule that out completely. But I think that's the least likely scenario here, to be honest. We have witness statements saying they saw Chris leave his camper, hop a fence, and head towards I-20. We also have the family member who spoke to Chris, who said himself he was walking along the interstate. Chris's wallet and keys were gone, which you'd expect if someone left their house willingly. Sure, Chris's car door was open, but that could be explained by a lot of things. Nobody reported seeing Chris talking to anyone near his camper before he went missing. Nobody reported any disturbances or arguments in the trailer park that morning.
It's always possible that the man witnesses saw jump the fence wasn't Chris, but that seems like a huge coincidence given the fact that Chris told someone on the phone that he was out near I-20. But I'm with you. We can't rule out the possibility that Chris was taken or forced from his camper, but I think that seems rather unlikely given the circumstances.
So that's where we are today, in the spring of 2025. Christopher Sanders would be 47 years old today. He is 5'9" and weighed approximately 210 pounds when he disappeared. He is white, he has reddish blonde hair and blue eyes, and sometimes has facial hair. He has multiple tattoos, including a diamond and clubs with flames on his left forearm, a spade and hearts with flames on his right forearm, a yin and yang symbol on his leg, mushrooms and a monkey on his abdomen, an eye on his chest, and aliens on his elbow. He was last seen wearing a black shirt with TCU on it, jeans, twisted X boots, a black hat with the letters TC in red, and sunglasses. He was last seen at around 9:45 a.m. walking eastbound along I-20 in Monahans, Texas. If you have any information, please contact the Monahans Police Department at 432-943-3254. We are excited to announce that we are now a part of the Darkcast Network. Darkcast Network, the best in indie podcasts. Check out all the great shows at darkcastnetwork.com.
I'm Ted,
I'm JJ.
and we're here to tell you about our show, Conspiring to Argue.
I like it.
That is not relevant. What do we do on the show?
Well, on our podcast, what we do is take conspiracy theories, and either Ted or myself will argue about if the conspiracy is real or not.
Yep, and sometimes the conspiracies are silly. Sometimes they're, in the pantheon of the greatest conspiracies of all time. It's a mixed bag.
Sometimes they're about aliens.
So check us out wherever you listen to podcasts.
Sometimes they're about murder.
Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the podcast creators, host, and guest. In 1996, my world was shattered when my Uncle Leon Laureles was shot execution style in a small town in Texas. To this day, his murder remains unsolved, and the pain of that injustice continues to haunt me, my family, and Leon's friends and coworkers. Here at Box in the Basement, we want to shed light on the overwhelming number of unsolved murders and disappearances here in Texas and beyond. We want to bring awareness to the lesser-known cases that got little to no attention, in hopes that someone listening will come forward with any information, because we strongly believe all lives matter. Ultimately, we want to get justice for Leon and for all the victims whose cases are sitting, collecting dust in a box in a basement. If you think bringing unsolved cases is important, then please take a moment to rate and review our podcast. Also, please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement podcasts and Justice for Leon Laurellis. You can now also find us on YouTube. If you like what you hear, please do us a favor and subscribe. It would help so much, my lovelies. Also, please share this episode so we can bring awareness to these lesser-known cases so we can reach more people in hopes that someone who may know something will come forward. I'd also like to ask that you sign my petition for my Uncle Leon Laurellis' case to be reopened and reviewed with fresh eyes. And you can find our petition on change.org. Thank you for joining us. Be kind. Later, Gators.